Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to call to order this regularly scheduled Intergovernmental Relations Committee meeting. I am the chair of the committee, Councilmember Johnson, and I'm joined today by a quorum of committee members, Councilmember Reich, Council Vice President and Vice Chair of the committee, Jenkins, and Councilmember Schrader. We're also joined by two of our colleagues, Councilmembers Goodman and Palmisano. We have two items for discussion today. The first is the redistricting ward boundaries following the 2020 census. Before I get into that presentation, I'll also mention that I'm standing because of some back problems, so it feels a little awkward to be standing during most of the presentation, but I assure you it's not to accentuate my height or anything like that. Mr. Carl, please take it away on our first item.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. As mentioned, my name is Casey Carl. I have the privilege of serving as clerk for the City of Minneapolis. May it please the committee, I'm here with your Intergovernmental Relations Director, Mr. Ranieri, and Assistant City Attorney Carol Bashoon to provide an introduction to redistricting and its impact on municipal elections. As the committee is aware, there are some legal issues which apply to the City of Minneapolis which make the process this time a little bit more complex compared to redistricting in prior years. Because this is the committee's first discussion about redistricting, I wanted to provide an overview of the process. So redistricting is the legally required process of redrawing boundaries of electoral districts every 10 years following the census. So redistricting really begins with the census. These processes go hand in hand, which is one of the reasons Minneapolis has invested significant resources in outreach and education about the 2020 census and the need for a complete count. The census is conducted in the first year of each new decade, that is, in the year ending in 0. The results data showing official population totals are released in the following year, with states and local jurisdictions receiving official results in the year ending in 1. An important objective of redistricting is to ensure fair political representation from federal and state levels down to local jurisdictions. Redistricting became a federal mandate as a result of the decision by the United States Supreme Court in Baker versus Carr in 1962. While states retain authority to establish standards for redistricting, they must comply with federal requirements and criteria, including the applicable portions of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution and Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, among others. Federal and state courts become involved in resolving disputes about redistricting when the process cannot be completed in a timely manner or where there are allegations of gerrymandering or racial discrimination. Timeliness is a factor in completing redistricting because of its impact on the conduct of elections at all levels. It's important that redistricting be finished in a timely manner so that new political boundaries are known well in advance of the election. This enables voters and candidates for public office to have certainty in those important processes. Consequently, there is an established sequencing in how redistricting is to be completed. It begins with the state legislature, which draws the lines for both congressional and state legislative districts, and then once the state legislature has completed its work, local jurisdictions must complete the redrawing of their districts. Local jurisdictions, as I'm using that term, includes primarily counties, cities, and townships, but also other types of local districts, such as our park district and the school district. State law carves out two timelines that govern redistricting. For our purposes, and as shown on this slide, there is a regular timeline and an alternate timeline. The regular timeline requires local jurisdictions to complete their redistricting plans within 60 days after action by the state legislature. In all cases, there is a definite starting point and a definite ending point. The starting point is April 1st in the year ending in 1, when we expect to get our official census results data back. This date is determined under Public Law 94171, which was enacted by the United States Congress in 1974, and it requires that official census results data be released to the states within 1 year of the day the census is conducted. Because Census Day is April 1st this year, we would anticipate then that final results data would be back to us April 1st of 2021. That process works like this. The Census Bureau submits the final results data to the governor's office in each state. The governor's office files a certified copy of that data with the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State then forwards the certified results data to all local jurisdictions so that they can complete redistricting. So April 1st, 2021 is the trigger for the rest of the entire scope of work to complete redistricting. The definitive ending date by which time all redistricting must be completed is no later than 19 weeks prior to the date of the statewide primary in the year ending in 2 following the census. This is established under Minnesota Statute Section 204B.135. In the current cycle, that means that the final deadline by which time all redistricting in the state of Minnesota must be completed for congressional, state legislative, and city ward boundaries is March 29, 2022. The state legislature has established what they call an aspirational goal to complete their own redistricting responsibilities no later than 25 weeks before the state primary in the year ending in 2 following the census. And this goal is codified in Minnesota statutes section 204B.14 subdivision 1A. When that timeline is applied to the current redistricting cycle, it means that the final deadline the state legislature has set for itself to act on redistricting is February 15, 2022. So if we begin with April 1st, 2021 as the official starting point and continue through to the end when the state has said it would be done February 15th of 2022, it means that the state's anticipated timeline to complete redistricting is a total of 320 calendar days. This timeline has consequences to the city of Minneapolis because our next municipal election is scheduled for 2021. And while it is possible that the state legislature might complete redistricting of all congressional and state legislative districts in 2021, I believe it is much more probable that the state will default to the alternate timeline, which is what it's done for the past 40 years. And of course, even then, it's likely the question of redistricting will be referred to the courts, just as it has for the past 4 decades. This table is copied from a website maintained from the State House. What it does is provide the key dates in the state's anticipated redistricting timeline. Highlighted in the red box is the provision that impacts Minneapolis. As you can see, this timeline presumes that the state will take until at least February 2022 to complete its work, which would then have cities completing redistricting plans by the end of March that same year. To be clear, under Minnesota law, all redistricting has to be completed by no later than 19 weeks before the primary in the year ending in 2, and that's March 29th. I'll return to the timeline in a moment. I wanted to finish with some other legal frameworks on redistricting. As this slide shows, the essential element of redistricting is that all wards must be as equal in population as practicable. So in the sample shown here, if the city's population were determined to be 390,000 residents, then each of the 13 wards would need to have an equalized population of 30,000. That's an ideal outcome. However, it is hardly ever, perhaps never, achieved that easily or cleanly. Redistricting is, after all, a political process that recognizes communities of shared interest, neighborhoods, and other factors that are not easily split purely on the basis of population alone. There are certain compositional factors that must be considered. For example, established standards require that wards and districts be compact and contiguous, and that districts cannot be more than twice as long as they are wide. And districts cannot be drawn in ways that pack certain populations together or which divide those populations apart, such that the result is a loss of actual or even potential political power and representation. These factors are generally referred to as packing or cracking, and they derive from provisions of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibits discrimination in the drawing of political boundaries based on race, color, or membership in a language minority group. Because of these factors, redistricting is never as simple as dividing total population into the number of available districts. To accommodate these adjustments, a standard acceptable deviation has been set which allows for a plus or minus 5% of the average overall population. So again, referring to the example on this slide, the over and under acceptable deviation would be a range of between 28,500 and 31,500 residents. Having all of those wards balanced within that population range would then be considered to have the wards equalized. Now that I've provided a high-level review of the legal framework, timeline, and parameters, I'd like to discuss roles and responsibilities. Charter Amendment number 171, which was adopted by voters at the ballot in 2010, assigns responsibility for the redistricting of city wards and park districts to the Minneapolis Charter Commission. The 2021 redistricting will be the Charter Commission's second time to redraw local political boundaries. Staff have made a handful of presentations to the Charter Commission about redistricting over the past year, and links to those files and presentations were included in your briefing material. The Minneapolis Charter provides additional requirements for redistricting that are unique to the city of Minneapolis. First, the Charter Commission is tasked with the duty of redrawing the lines. Second, in order to provide for a broader and more diverse perspective and to provide more opportunity for meaningful public participation, the Charter Commission is required to appoint up to 9 advisory members who are part of the redistricting effort. Together, the Charter Commission and that advisory group constitute the Minneapolis Redistricting Group. The charter also requires that the Charter Commission maintain a 45-day application period, during which time individuals interested in being considered for appointment as an advisor group members can submit their interests. As a consequence of this long application period, all the timelines prepared by staff have that application period beginning in September of this year so that the appointments can be made prior to January 2021. Staff has anticipated that the Charter Commission would use the early months of 2021 for orientation, a series of staff-led learning labs, and initial community outreach and education. The goal is to complete as much of the preparatory work as possible before the official census results data are received by April 1st. Where redistricting gets particularly interesting for the city of Minneapolis is in reconciling our regular 4-year election cycle within the 10 years of a decade. There will always be a full 4-year term that's divided between decades and by the requirement to redraw electoral districts. This creates a rub in which there will periodically be regular elections timed to occur before the boundaries of those local districts have been redrawn. And further complicating this balancing act is the complex ballot that reflects the city's governance structure. As you know, our municipal ballot includes 25 separate offices with a mix of both single-seat and multi-seat or at-large races, and of course we use the alternative ranked choice voting method. And all 25 of those offices are on the ballot at the same time. It is, quite honestly, one of the most complex municipal ballots in the nation. This slide then provides a visual representation of what the city must do. We must balance the interrelated requirements of both election law and redistricting law, and it is bridged by what I've referred to as the Kahn Rule, codified as Minnesota Statutes 205.84. The Kahn Rule was the legislative result of the outcome in Kahn versus Griffin, a case determined in 2005. In that lawsuit, Representative Kahn and others sued the city because the municipal election in 2001 was conducted using ward boundaries that used census data from 1990. Redistricting in that decade was completed in 2002 after the municipal election in 2001, which used the old census data. The result was that new ward boundaries created in 2002 were not effective until 2005, halfway through that decade and the regular census process. The suit alleged malapportioned wards and asserted that this was unconstitutional and in violation of the one-person, one-vote principle articulated by the United States Supreme Court. Ultimately, the city prevailed in that lawsuit, and the court opined in its 2001 that the 2001 municipal election, based on 1990 data, did not result in an unrepresentative wards, and it did not violate the constitutional principle of one person, one vote. In fact, the court stated that requiring rigid mathematical equality at all times would result in negative consequences that should be factored into the calculus of weighing these matters. Some of those issues that were highlighted by the court included the need for stability and predictability in elective terms, the potential fiscal impact to taxpayers caused by the increased number of local elections, the added challenge or difficulty posed to certain populations in participating in more frequent local elections, particularly those of limited means, and the consequences to both voters, candidates, and elected officials in determining the settled expectations for local elections. In short, the court indicated that delaying the implementation of new ward boundaries was not ideal, but that this single factor must be balanced against other considerations and not be solely dictated by the objective of mandating a municipal election immediately after a census. Nevertheless, the state legislature enacted in 2010 an amendment that dealt with this timing irregularity, which I've referred to as the Kahn Rule. Here you see the text of the Kahn Rule. I've highlighted the relevant portion, which states that if no municipal general election would otherwise occur in a year ending in 2 or 3 following a census, then a general municipal election must be held in one of those years. A further complication is the fact that this rule applies to the members of city council. It does not apply to the mayor, who is elected from the citywide, and it doesn't apply to the park board or to the Board of Estimate and Taxation. So as shown here.
We have a question or comment from Vice Chair Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. And I think you just answered my question, but I guess my question is, does this rule only apply to Minneapolis or and the city council? And you already indicated no park, no school, no library board, which doesn't exist anymore, but
Mr. Chair, Council Vice President Jenkins, the amendment 205.84 applies to cities of the first class where all members of the city council are elected concurrently from wards. So that would apply to the cities of Minneapolis and the city of St. Paul. No, Duluth has a mixture of at-large and ward-based elections for their council, so it does not apply to the city of Duluth.
We have a question or comment from Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't want to interrupt the clerk's presentation, but there is quite a lot of detail about some of these questions in a memo that our city attorney's office put together, which is for sure linked in the Charter Commission's previous agenda. It may be in this agenda as well, which raises some questions to the Council Vice President's point about, the merit of the law that really only applies to Minneapolis and perhaps maybe St. Paul, and kind of outlines the ways in which it's not, perhaps in spirit was intended to affect other cities, but isn't because of the way it was written. So we would potentially have some legal action to take based on those kinds of questions. So if my colleagues haven't seen it, I think it is in today's agenda. Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Mr. Carl.
Mr. Chair, there are copies of the legal opinion from our Assistant City Attorney, Ms. Bashoon, who's here in your packets that I passed out. Those materials will be uploaded to the website as soon as the meeting's over. The other interesting piece about the Kahn Rule is that, as you can see here, it trumps any home rule charter provision that might otherwise attempt to address election cycles. So consequently, under any scenario, the city would need to comply with this statute, either as it is currently expressed or possibly with a potential amendment. And what I've tried to do on this slide is to reflect that triangle showing the balance of laws between elections and redistricting bridged by the Kahn Rule. What I've done is add some specific data points. On the far left in green, you see the census dates beginning with this year. And then on the far right in blue, you see the dates of regular municipal elections starting in 2021, our next regularly scheduled election. The asterisks are shown to indicate those years when a regular city election would fall in the year that triggers the Kahn Rule. So those are the years that end in 1. The census and election dates are connected with orange lines to represent that the Kahn Rule is triggered in those years. So what you see here is a regular recurring 20-year pattern. And this means that every 20 years, when regular municipal elections occur in a year that ends in 1 following a census, an additional election would be required just for the 13 council members in the year ending in either 2 or 3. We've assumed that those elections would occur in the year ending in 3 because that's aligned with our existing odd-year municipal election cycle. And so that would mean an election for council members in 2023, halfway between the regular elections in 2021 and 2025. And if this scheme weren't already complicated enough, the state legislature in 2010, the same year that the Kahn Rule was enacted, also amended general state election laws that would allow cities of the first class electing council members in a year ending in 1, and to complete their redistricting in the same year, but ahead of the state legislature. So prior to that amendment, you could not act before the legislature. So at the same time that the Kahn Rule went into place, an amendment to general election law was passed, that's 204B135, that said cities who have this occurrence, where they do their regular election in the year ending in 1, can go ahead and do their redistricting before the state legislature. What it does is allow us to complete that redistricting ahead of time, but that law does not apply to the redrawing of districts for example, the Park Board and the Board of Estimate and Taxation.
Mr. Carl, we have a question or comment from Councilmember Goodman.
Now I have 2, I think. With regard to the potential legal opinion, what is the remedy? The remedy is that we would run in 2021 for a 4-year term, and then we'd be doing exactly what we did when this went into place in 2001, where you'd be representing some people that elected you, and then you'd be like looking to represent people who would elect you, and it's the same chaos that that the Kahn Rule was trying to avoid. So what is the remedy should there be litigation? It's a 4-year term, but it's this crappy 4-year term like we had before, where you have like 40,000 constituents because you got the people who elected you and the people who might elect you?
Through the chair, Councilmember Goodman, the city attorney's opinion, I certainly don't need to speak for Ms. Bashoon. In brief, what the opinion puts forward is that the charter itself helps to solve the problem posed by Kahn. So initially, as staff looked at this, we had assumed, because the language of Kahn says you have to have a general municipal election. Under other state law that applies to all cities, it says that the term set by state law for council members is 4 years. So if Kahn could be interpreted in a general way, saying you're having a general election in 2023, we've had this conversation about splitting the ballot. In one odd year, you'd have the mayor, the park board, the board of estimate taxation, and in the next odd year, you'd have council. But our charter specifically says that council members run in a year following a year that's evenly divisible by 4. So that means 2025 would be the next municipal election year. So the effect of both the Kahn Rule and our charter is such that we would have our regular election in 2021. That's for a 4-year term. We would have an election in 2023 because the Kahn Rule would apply. This is that bridge to election law and redistricting. That would be for a 4-year term as currently written. But the effect of the charter is to essentially interrupt that 4-year term and recreate the 4-year term in 2025. And then the whole ballot would be together. So while we would say in common parlance, that's a 2-year term, a 2-year term, and a 4-year term, the law as currently written doesn't recognize a 2-year term. It says council members are elected to a 4-year term. So the practical effect is a 2-2-4, but in reality, you're running for a 4-year term, you get elected, Kahn kicks in, interrupts that schedule and says, here's another 4-year term, notwithstanding that you had one. And then the charter kicks in and interrupts that effect and says, here is the next 4-year term. And then the elections would continue for the next 20 years.
I'm sorry, I hope everyone followed that. I'm just a little bit unsure about what is the remedy of litigation. The remedy of litigation is to say it's a 2-year term followed by a 4-year term. I mean, should we determine that there's some sort of legal case here, which I have not been convinced of, what's the difference? You pretty much have to have an election after a redistricting in order to equalize the wards based on the massive population problem we have now. So I'm confused as to why we're talking about litigation unless I understand what the remedy for some sort of litigation is.
Mr. Chair, to clarify, we're not talking about litigation.
I didn't mean to.
So I'll move forward very quickly. We're actually here to present a series of policy objectives to frame further consideration. Staff have identified a number of potential statutory changes and charter changes that would allow us to live within this triangle, to meet the intent of Kahn, to clarify it potentially, to say when it applies to us, it's a 2-year term and therefore not applicable to that 4-year term and interrupting. So there's a series of proposed legislative changes at both the state and local levels that staff would recommend based on the direction council gives us. So with your permission, I'll run forward to that and we can.
But I also had a question about the second thing that you had mentioned, which was that the legislature has allowed the city to redistrict prior to the state redistricting.
Mr. Chair, that is a law enacted in 2010, as I noted, that says the cities can go ahead and complete their redistricting ahead of the state legislature. We can do that. However, if the state draws lines that create a conflict for us, it provides an allowance that we may have to shift some precinct boundaries because the precinct boundaries, which the city council is responsible for creating, cannot be split between different districts.
But in no situation will we be able to redistrict before we get the numbers. And that is
Correct.
April, at
Of
the
2021.
earliest, April 1st of 2021.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
We have Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess the reason I brought up the legal memo and some of these other things in response to Council Vice President's question is because I don't think we really have a great option here. The new state law is in conflict with our charter. It seems like we need to amend our charter. I know a lot of folks are not really paying attention to this, partly because it's so complicated in the general public. I think after this next election, whichever choice we collectively make as a city, I think we will do our very best to do right by our voters. But I think a lot more people will start paying attention after that election happens and probably won't be very happy with it because we don't have a great option. So I think, sure, we should all be thinking about this next election that's coming up because that's the next thing. But for the long-term health of our cities, democratic participation and governance, I think we should be thinking long term. I think if the legislature is really concerned with the values of the law they passed, it's not really reaching most of the state's population. So that was one point I think was made clear in the memo that's worth noting, because we should, if the goal of the law is to make sure that people are accurately represented, then it should apply to all of the communities of Minnesota. We're doing our very best in Minneapolis to react to something that, again, is going to require a lot of change, whether to our charter, to our election cycles, to the way we govern as a city. If we have offset elections, I think people will start paying attention when they find out at the polls that they're confused or whatever may happen depending on which of the options that we pick. But I hope we will all continue to think longer term past this next one election.
Mr. Chair, I would add, as I said a little bit ago, the Charter Commission has had several discussions about the theory of redistricting and the impact of this at a higher level as they're responsible for drawing those lines, and as the timeline gets closer, those conversations are moving more into the practical world. And I know that they are interested in developing a solution to this challenge to us and not just sort of solve it this one time and let it go down the road for another 20 years and someone else solve it. So they are looking at long-term solutions, some of which we'll talk about today. This slide shows what I would call the anticipated city timeline and key dates. Again, as Councilmember Goodman just mentioned, we start on April 1st of 2021. That's the day we would expect to get census results back that tell us what our new population results are. That's done at the block level. We recreate all of the block level data, and then there are two deadlines, as you can see here, July 13th and March 29th. July 13th, 2021 is the early schedule. That's the deadline if we want to have new wards in place before we have our next municipal election in 2021, then the law that allows us to go early, that 204B135 shown here, if you follow that, it says you must be done no later than 14 days before candidate filing for that election opens. Candidate filing in 2021 is scheduled to open on July 27th. 14 days before that is July 13th. So that's the drop dead. If we miss it, we're done. I've proposed, in order to give us a contingency when I've talked to the Charter Commission, that they plan on being done by June 30th, the date shown just below that, because not only would they have to finish that work, we in the clerk's office, working with the council, have to have precincts done at the same time. So we're doing concurrently the wards and the precincts, and then we have to publish all of that information to make it official, and we have to make sure that all the candidates and the voters and campaigns are well aware of the new borders, both for wards and precincts, and we would have to, if there's a change, find new polling places within each of those precincts. So I've given a buffer saying if we're done by June 30th, that gives my staff about 2 weeks to do that work before we have to be done. Alternatively, so that's the early timeline in 2021. Alternatively, all redistricting must be done by that second deadline, March 29th of 2022, because that is 19 weeks before the date of the state primary in the year ending in 2. That's the drop dead for the state, for the county, for the city, and everyone else. You must be done at that time for the same reason, so that candidates and voters know before the state primary what those new boundaries are. So this is the anticipated timeline for the city that reflects both an early completion and a late completion. And then I mentioned that in order to help focus our efforts, the staff, primarily myself, Mr. Ranieri, Ms. Bashoon, and some others who have been part of this work, tried to think about a policy framework to guide our thoughts and our decision-making as we come forward to the council. And so we came up with these 5, what we called policy objectives as a framework. From staff's perspective, what we believe is that any redistricting proposal should focus on the following options. First and foremost, it should comply with all applicable laws, including the Kahn Rule, relative to both redistricting and elections. Second, we need to make sure that we pursue options that ensure a consistent cycle that's predictable for municipal elections so that voters can depend on that predictable schedule, something that's not subject to frequent change or irregularities, and with as few deviations as possible. We believe that having that consistent and predictable schedule supports strong voter participation and turnout, and that's a hallmark of both good governance and has been a hallmark of the city of Minneapolis. Third, we believe that it's important to preserve, to the extent possible, the existing unified municipal ballot that encompasses all 25 of those offices. That includes the mayor, 13 council wards, 6 park districts, 3 at-large park seats, and 2 at-large seats for the Board of Estimate and Taxation. Relatedly, the fourth objective that staff identified is to minimize the expense associated with having a separate election only for council members, not to mention avoiding the potential for lower voter turnout. And finally, the fifth objective we've identified was a preference to pursue alternatives that reduce the number of substantive legislative changes, whether statutory or charter or both, that would be necessary for a successful implementation. By this, what we mean is that we would prioritize alternatives that have a realistic chance for success, but also satisfy all the other policy objectives.
Mr. Carl, we have a question or comment from Vice Chair Jenkins.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I just want to state for the record, this feels like a unfunded mandate that creates an undue burden to the taxpayers of the city of Minneapolis and St. Paul.
Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's no more of an unfunded mandate than the presidential primary was, because we're going through that right now, and we're not being reimbursed for that either, and no one said anything about that when that happened. I'm wondering if you could tell me, have the staff vetted these policy objectives with the mayor's office? Is the mayor as committed to this unified ballot as the staff seem to be? And I don't think there's unanimity within the council on whether or not the unified ballot is a top priority.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, I may not have made clear. These are objectives staff identified. This is the first time they've been rolled out to any policymaker. And so with apologies for that, it was our intent to make sure to get in front of you for this first public discussion and say, this is where staff is. And what we're asking is if you concur in these objectives, if there are more we haven't identified, if this is a sufficient framework. And then my next step was within this policy objective framework to share with you that we have at staff level evaluated 2 proposals and to share the results of those proposals with you.
Chair Johnson, thank you for letting me be here. It's unfortunate more members of the council are not here to hear this, and it sounds like there's going to be more conversation about this, but I would think we would want the mayor's office and park board members to weigh in on this question of whether or not the single unified ballot is a top priority for everybody, because I would guess if it means they have to run an extra time, it won't be.
So, Mr. Chair, I will try and get through these examples. These are in your packet, and so in your packet you have a copy of the PowerPoint, but you also have a separate piece of paper towards the back. I think it might be maybe the second to the last paper. It takes both of the alternatives that staff looked at and puts them side by side for comparative purposes and evaluates each one of them against the 5 policy objectives that staff had identified. Again, staff identified. If there are others to be considered, we would welcome that feedback. This first alternative redistricting approach is what I would call the no change approach. And by that, what I mean is that we would anticipate the existing cycle of regular elections continuing with the next municipal election in 2021. This particular scenario assumes the Charter Commission completes its redistricting of ward boundaries in 2021 in time for the new wards to be in place for the statutory deadline tied to the first date of candidate filing. So here we're recommending final action to adopt new ward boundaries by June 30th. And on one hand, there is the potential the city might complete its redistricting, redraw its ward boundaries, conduct the regular election in 2021, and satisfy all of the statutory and charter requirements. In that case, there would be no need for an election in 2023. Under this scenario, we have achieved all of those policy objectives that were identified. However, there has to be that safety provision built in with this proposal just in case we aren't able to complete redistricting in time for 2021. So if redistricting cannot be completed for any reason in time for a 2021 election based on new wards, then we would have an additional election in 2023 just for the council members midway through those original terms. This mid-year election in 2023, however, would only be for a single 2-year term. Reference the city attorney's a legal opinion that talks about the impact of our charter and its effect on writing the Kahn Amendment. So what that means is that the council members would stand for election again in 2025 with the mayor, with the park board, with the Board of Estimate and Taxation, and it would reestablish a unified municipal ballot, which is one of our policy objectives. This is because the charter explicitly states in section 4.2b that council members are elected in a year following a year evenly divisible by 4. So by the math, 2020 and 2024 are both years evenly divisible by 4. So the regular municipal elections would program in 2021 and 2025. Thus, while the Kahn Rule would necessitate council members to stand for election in 2023 to ensure that wards reflect an equalized population based on the most current data, the city charter would qualify the impact of that election such that we would be able to reunify the entire ballot in 2025. And so that satisfies 4 of the 5 policy objectives shown on this slide. It does not avoid extra costs for the midterm election, but it is limited to a one-time expense every 20 years rather than adding a municipal election every other year to the 4-year cycle. So under this alternative, there are some technical corrections to both state law and city charter staff would recommend. Those are relatively minor and would help to clarify the intent of the underlying legal principles. So as shown here, I've color-coded the policy objectives for this alternative. Green indicates the alternative satisfies the objective. Yellow indicates that the alternative partially satisfies the objective. Red would indicate the alternative does not satisfy the objective. So here you can see that with alternative number 1, we fully satisfy legal compliance and predictable cycles for voters. We partially satisfy the unified ballot, minimized expense, and reducing of changes.
Mr. Carl, we have a question or comment from Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And there is also an election each even year because of the state legislature and presidential elections. So in this scenario, there'd be an election every year between 2021 and 25, and then we'd skip 1 year. I'm just imagining the full election cycle for a voter in Minneapolis. Okay.
Correct.
Thank you.
So this then is the second alternative that staff has evaluated. It would change the terms of all of the city's elected officials, and it would provide a set sequencing of regular elections. So instead of 4-year terms, this alternative would require those terms to be tied to specific election dates. Those election dates would be in the years ending in 1, 3, and 7. This essentially creates a recurring pattern of elections for all city officials that has a 2-year term in the year ending in 1, followed by 2 years and 3 and 7. And that resembles the election cycle that's followed by the Minnesota Senate. And what you can see on this table is that this would fully satisfy the first 3 policy objectives. It would partially satisfy the 4th objective, and that's because whereas in the first alternative there would at least be 5 municipal regular elections in a 20-year period, there would for sure be 6. So this guarantees a greater number of elections within a 20-year period, so it's more costly. And then also it does not satisfy the final one on reducing changes because of the need to, I think Councilmember Goodman was hitting on this earlier, the need for half the ballot who is not affected by Kahn would have to be enlisted in that effort. The mayor, the park board, and the BET are not affected. If we were to go forward to amend the charter and get state legislative changes to do that, we would want to be starting conversations with them now in order to get that at the state legislature. As I mentioned, state law, the general election law for council members sets the term at 4 years. So we would need to seek a change from the general municipal terms set by state law, and we'd need to amend our charter, and we would need to enlist the other municipal offices in that effort. So I put a red on this alternative. I also would point out that the Charter Commission, at its last meeting, has decided to pursue consideration of the first alternative, in part because of many of the reasons I mentioned. It's the least disruptive or least significant change. It already is the cycle that voters are used to. The only difference is that every 20 years there might be a glitch if we cannot get redistricting done in the year ending in 1. And so for that reason, they are pursuing their process around alternative redistricting plan 1. And with that, I would close very quickly, Mr. Chair, to say that our ask of this committee and of the council members is to see if the policy objective framework that staff identified is sufficient, if there are other things, other factors we should add. If there is a preferred alternative, notwithstanding the fact I have just disclosed the Charter Commission is pursuing alternative number 1, other feedback or directions you have for us, and then to note that at their last meeting last week, the Charter Commission did announce they will be conducting a public hearing at their next meeting on Wednesday, March 4th at 4 p.m. in this chamber on a potential charter amendment to address specifically the impact of the Kahn Rule that could be submitted to voters this November as a ballot question. With that, the staff are happy to respond to any questions the committee might have.
Thank you, Mr. Carl. Do we have any questions or comments from committee members? I appreciate that. Obviously, this is a very technical topic, very weighty in detail, and I think Council President Bender really hit the nail on the head with the fact that there's really no perfect solution here and no great options. So we're really weighing a lot of different trade-offs in the process of looking at this, but we really appreciate all the time that staff put into this. I know a lot of research, a lot of work was done to arrive at this, and I think that going forward, it's also going to be one of the things that's on us and a challenge to explain to voters, whatever the outcome is of this, how they wound up with an additional election that now they have to engage on and the additional expense around that, or some of these other consequences that you experience when you have, for instance, ostensibly a two-year election. For instance, we could have individuals elected in 2021 to the city council who will essentially be running for re-election before they even vote on their first budget. And there are consequences that go beyond just the additional asks and burdens on the voters of the city. We have a comment or question from Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually appreciate you bringing up some of those governance questions, because I think regardless of where this lands, there will be governance changes. For example, the biennial budget that we were discussing, one of the reasons I was concerned about amending the charter was because in one scenario, there would be a council that would have never voted on a budget until after potentially a two-year term had passed. It would be a lame duck council that had never voted on a budget. Maybe some people preferred that, but I didn't think that was great for the council. I think I want to say a couple things. First, I've been attending the Charter Commission meetings, and I appreciate the thoughtfulness that they're bringing to this. I do think it's worth noting for the public and my colleagues that a lot of that conversation is focused on and feel free to reach out to Charter Commission members yourselves. I don't want to speak for them, but they're talking a lot about sort of the weight between how much time and effort to put into community engagement around the redistricting process itself, because they did so much innovative and important work in engagement last time, versus speeding up the redistricting process so that we might be able to have an election that would keep the cycle on its current track. And so I just think it's important to know that. I don't know the answer to which is more important, engaging members of the public on the redistricting process itself versus potentially in the election itself. I do represent a ward where there's a large disparity between neighborhoods and precincts in voter turnout, and you have to work really, really, really hard to turn out voters in low turnout precincts. I represent a ward where most people don't know who their city council member is. I know that when I've talked with voters in my community, the mayor's election does seem to generate more interest and excitement. I saw a big difference about how much people knew about the mayor's election versus city council stuff. So I do, just based on my own personal anecdotal evidence, in one part of the city, worry that an election that had only city council members would be a lower voter turnout election, and therefore, particularly in parts of the city where we worked so hard to engage folks that are higher renter, higher populations of color, those places overlap with the places that have low voter turnout, that we would be disenfranchising voters by having a very low turnout election for the city council, which has such an important role in advocating for constituents in the city. So I've voiced that many times. I thought it was worth voicing it here. I'm a little disappointed that Alternative 2 is getting such little conversation. There's been a lot of talk at the Charter Commission about the convenience of council members, but we're likely going to have a 2-year term. We might have 2 2-year terms. We might be running in a ward that we don't even know. I mean, there's going to be inconvenience for council members. I'm not hearing them talk about inconvenience for any of the other elected offices in the city, and weighing that against what to me seems like a much clearer, easier to follow election cycle for a typical resident in our city. That might, where it all stays on the same ballot. It's a clear and consistent pattern of 2-year, 4-year, 4-year terms every 10 years. Then redistricting happens. So to me, that just seems more clear, more predictable. I understand that it would inconvenience a lot of other elected officials. But for me, that's worth having that conversation and saying, where is really the priority for our residents who we're all here to support and represent?
Any other comments or questions from committee members? Just building off of the redistricting piece, I think that, certainly we obviously have to wait for the census data to become available, but I know there's a lot of other data sources that are available around population changes that have occurred in our city, and so we are able to get fairly accurate with that. And I think in investment up front in the engagement and being able to make sure that we're prepared for that, we have a good idea where things are going to line up, and to be able to have those conversations with residents makes a lot of sense when you consider that the alternative is, if we miss that timeline, it is going to be millions of dollars additional for taxpayers and additional burdens and asks on voters as well. Mr. Carl.
Chair, if I could, I'm sorry I didn't have this ready. I shut it down too soon. I don't think I'm out of line. I'm not speaking for the Charter Commission in any way, shape, or form, but at their last meeting, Mr. Clegg, the chair of the Charter Commission, who couldn't be here today, did mention, so I did want to call attention to the council members, that the charter itself does provide under the article on boundaries, which is where we find the provisions related to redistricting, that the city council may enact an ordinance necessary and prudent to implement this section. And so, as Mr. Clegg told his colleagues on the Charter Commission, this body could adopt an ordinance saying we want redistricting done in 2021, make it happen. I think the Charter Commission is looking for that direction or what preference the council as a body has. This is our first public discussion, which is why I think it's important for this body to look at the proposed policy framework, add to it, or we've got on the agenda approving it as it is. We can always come back and revisit that. I know we're out of time and have to move quickly, and I apologize for that. This is a very, very complex, nuanced issue, set of issues that overlap, redistricting and municipal elections, the impact. I would also share with you, I did say this, but maybe to hit a little bit harder on this point, this is only the second time the Charter Commission has done redistricting. The only experience they have was from 10 years ago, the first time they did it. Now, many members have done redistricting. I don't want to disqualify that. But as a body, for the first time with the requirements under our charter, it was our first time. And so a lot of time was spent sort of creating the foundation. We've done that work, and knowing that we are under a tight timeline, the staff level compared to 10 years ago, I mean, here's the staff people who were supporting the Charter Commission 10 years ago. Ms. Bashoon and myself. This year, we already have a group of staff that represents the Race Equity Division from the City Coordinator's Office, the Results Minneapolis from the City Coordinator's Office, the IT Data Analytics team, the IT GIS team, the Clerk's Office, the Attorney's Office, and many other groups that have come together to help provide. We have a staff team of at least, I think, 20-some people. And one of the things we've talked about doing is flipping the schedule. Instead of waiting for April to start, we've got the rest of this year and the early months of 2021 to talk about, to your point, Mr. Chair. There are other data sources. We could begin to do community outreach and education. We could begin to do how has the population shifted? Where have we grown? Where have we lost populations? What do those populations look like? What are those trends? And so I think that it is not impossible that we could do a good set of outreach and engagement such that people are ready when we start on April 1st. We could move quickly. I don't think that's outside the realm of possibility. I do think it would help the Charter Commission to know where this body stands and to have sort of that alignment between this body, which will be living with the results of the wards that are drawn and also drawing precincts within those wards, and the Charter Commission who has to draw the wards. So I know that there were some proposals to take action on the policy framework and the redistricting alternative, and I appreciate that in the interest of time, perhaps we should come back at a next meeting, give council members a chance to reflect on that. I do appreciate the time that you've given me to present this and know that the Charter Commission will be pleased to know that we've started that process.
Mr. Carl, I really appreciate those comments. I think that's a great suggestion, and the more we can look at, can we set up a way to engage residents and complete that redistricting in a way that meets our expectations and our standards for quality, but also avoids these unintended consequences related to this law. I think that would be ideal. So, not seeing any further comments, or Councilmember Goodman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't think it's possible to do the redistricting that fast. And I think it's silly for people to think that that's within the realm of possibility, because the actual data won't get to us until the earliest April 1st. But you know from running yourself that most people will make a decision about whether or not they're going to run this year, for sure by the end of this year. And so what this does is it almost creates a situation where challengers are really challenged to determine if they're going to run, because they don't know what ward they're going to be in. They don't know if they'll be redistricted. If they're even close to a line, then will they be in one ward or another? And so I don't want to call it an incumbent protection thing, but it seems to me by pushing the deadline for redistricting almost 14 days before the candidate filing, it leaves challengers, could be in open seats, I'm not suggesting even amongst us, that it leaves it so late in the game that we might like it because we won't have to campaign for like a whole year and a half. It'll just be part of a year. But who will know no one will know where they actually are in reality. And that's if the legislature gets us the actual information. And that's a big if. It hasn't happened in 40 years, not one time in 40 years. And I personally wouldn't say, well, we're going to win the Senate, therefore they're going to do it quickly. Even then, we could lose a seat in Congress, so that could take time. The earliest possible date we could get the numbers would be April 1st, and under that scenario, the completion deadline is still 14 days before July 27th, which is the filing, so it feels like it's really compressed. I just don't see practically how it happens. That said, I personally don't like the two-year term thing. I think what that does is create a problem for our staff and the enterprise overall, and the feeling that we're in constant election mode, which is really stressful to staff. This is like, the Titanic. This is a big business that 13 people govern, but hundreds and hundreds of people run. And the uncertainty over the election is a problem as well. So I'm certainly not saying this isn't a problem. It is for governance of the city, but a bigger problem, in my opinion, would be trying to rush through a redistricting process that doesn't tell anyone who's in what ward until 14 days before the filing deadline. A challenger or someone running for an open seat could work from November, December of this year through 6 months of next year and then find out they're in a different ward. I mean, you kind of have to know where you're going to live and what ward you're in before you make a decision about whether you're not going to run. And I think that will be perceived as an incumbent protection effort. And so I would just caution us. I do think there's another argument about the running of the city, and it's legit. But the narrative we're going to hear out of this is a setup to protect incumbents because challengers will not have the ability to run given this timeline. I just want to note that.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman. And just to clarify with Mr. Carl, isn't the regular timeline that the redistricting is supposed to be complete in 60 days? I know there is an alternative, but it is 60 days is considered the regular timeline. Yes, absolutely. Certainly. Council President Benner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also think there are some real questions about redistricting and then having the election that quickly, but one of which is that could also happen to incumbents. Incumbents wouldn't know which ward they were living in either. So I'm not sure that it's really an incumbent protection strategy. There's almost certainly going to be compression. The city is not growing equally. So there will be big shifts and mostly in the center of the city. So I think a lot of incumbents could end up living in similar wards. So, I mean, it's just that there are a lot of issues created by this new law that we have to comply with, and that is one of them. I think this one might have equal effect on incumbents and challengers.
Thank you. I appreciate those comments. I would agree that with really any one of the scenarios, you could make an argument either for or against incumbent or challenger advantage. And the reality is that there's trade-offs with all of these. So not seeing any further comments, what I'll do is move the receive and file and then postpone to the next cycle any sort of approval of the policy objectives or an alternative timeline. So not seeing any discussion on that. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, the motion carries. We do have our federal, state, local, legislative updates on the agenda, but are we good, Mr. Ranieri, waiving the timeline because of BET? Excellent. Thank you. I will go ahead then and postpone that. We'll just vote on that. All those in approval, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, the motion carries. With seeing no further business before us, this meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everyone, for your patience on the presentation as well.